Hello and welcome. My name is Sri Krishna and I'm with the Bangalore Literature Festival. On behalf of the festival and the Bangalore International Center, a very warm welcome to you all to WorldLit. For those of you listening in for the first time, WorldLit is the Bangalore Literature Festival's digital literary platform, bringing to you live stream sessions, video interviews, and podcasts with leading international and Indian authors. We're delighted to be partnering with the Bangalore International Center for this. We launched WorldLit a few months ago, and we've had some very interesting conversations on the platform with the likes of Pico Iyer, Anthony Horowitz, Peter James, and most recently, Tracy Chevalier. We're very excited about how the platform is evolving, and we hope to feature more authors in the days to come. Today, we are absolutely delighted to bring to you British novelist Deborah Moggach. She's written over 15 novels to date, including The Ex-Wives, Tulip Fever, and is likely to be very popular in India for the best Exotic Marigold Hotel. She's also adapted many of her novels as TV dramas, including the BAFTA-nominated screenplay for Pride and Prejudice. Deborah is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a former chair of the Society of Authors, and is on the executive committee of PEN. In conversation with Deborah this evening is Jaishree Misra, known to all of us here, a regular on the literary circuit, has also been at the Bangalore Literature Festival a few times, an Indian author whose debut novel Ancient Promises was published and became a major bestseller both in India and abroad. Deborah has an MA in English Literature from the Kerala University and two postgraduate diplomas from the University of London in special education and broadcast journalism. Jaishree, welcome to WorldLit. Absolutely delighted to have both you and Deborah with us. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Sri Krishna. Generous introduction. And Debbie, this is such a pleasure for me. I ought to get all my fangirling out of the way first, I think, lest I gush on and on for a full hour, the hour that we have, because it's hard to imagine that I've actually got you here in my living room. I've got to get you actually on that, park you on that settee that you can see behind me, but we'll work on that. But on behalf, I suppose, due to the portal that's hosting us, I should be saying welcome to Bangalore, a city that you're not exactly unfamiliar with, are you?
No. I mean, I visited Bangalore a long time ago, and I wrote the best Exotic Marigold Hotel set there because I loved it. I mean, I love India in general, but Bangalore touched my heart, and also I thought it would be quite suitable for old people to retire to because the climate is so good. You know, it's not too wildly hot, and it's more like an English climate. So I thought I would choose that, and also because Bangalore has such a big Silicon Valley, and I wanted to bring in the whole world of call centers and things in my novel, which was published. I mean, it was published. I've just checked. It was published in 2004. So the whole call center culture was much newer then. So.
I also read somewhere that you found the name Bangalore sort of irresistibly comic. Is that okay to say it here? I wonder, to a field full of Bangaloreans.
For some reason it is. I mean, when they shot the film, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, they switched to Jaipur. And Jaipur to me isn't funny at all. Of course, it's a very beautiful city. And even I, who love Bangalore, must say that Jaipur's a tiny bit more photogenic, perhaps, with its lovely pink palaces and monkeys and everything. But that you know, Bangalore is the place in my heart and the place that the book is set in.
I read it, yes, exactly. The name Best Exotic Marigold Hotel was just a name in the book when I read it. It was the original name that was used for the hotel, isn't it, in These Foolish Things?
That's right. Well, when the book was reissued, when the film came out, the hotel was originally called Dunromin, which is a very sort of Victorian, very old Raj sort of name for a hotel. Because it was set, you see, my Bangalore, of course, is an imaginary one. And
I wondered how much of it had actually emerged from your imagination, because I know you lived in Pakistan. I wasn't sure about India, though.
Yes, I've never lived in India. I visited many times. I lived in Pakistan in the 70s for 2 years. But India was always this tantalizing, wonderful country, but unreachable because the border was closed then. And so I could never go there. And I just longed to go. So for 2 years I lived in Karachi, which was a whole other story. But even though obviously the two countries are very different, I felt very much at home when I finally went to India as a tourist. And I feel very strongly that a lot of British people, when they land in India, feel at home, and vice versa, because we've got this deep history together, for better or for worse, you know, whatever we think of the Raj and Empire. And, you know, America has Southeast Asia and all that. They've got a link to that. But our very strong link is between Britain and India. And, you know, my Indian friends in Britain feel totally British, and my English friends in India. You know, it's a fascinating, complicated, deep-rooted relationship.
And I thought you'd captured Bangalore very well, because I've lived there. I've actually been a schoolgirl in Bangalore for about, way back in the 70s. And that, I think that was the Bangalore that your book captured beautifully, because I mean, I wondered whether you could read just a tiny little paragraph that sets the scene for those people who haven't read These Foolish Things. Yeah. And I think I should be telling our audience that the book was called These Foolish Things, and it's probably still available under that title in a lot of old Indian libraries. But if you were to go and buy the book now, obviously you have to look for The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. That is,
yes.
The book was remade after the film came out, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, some readers were really cross because they went and bought The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, and it's exactly the same, except the name of the hotel has changed. And they thought I was conning them by trying to buy two books, but I wasn't. It was just that. But just a word about it: my Bangalore was altered to suit my story, and so I've excused myself at the beginning of the book, saying, you know, but memory plays tricks on us all, because I wanted to have, for instance, I needed the Marigold Hotel is set in my imagination in sort of old military lines, those old bungalows which are often converted into, you know, water departments and guest houses. Because
that's the bungalow I remember, yeah.
Yes, because of course it was a cantonment town in the time of the Raj.
Exactly.
And but Silicon Valley wasn't dreamt of when I visited way back. And the old city, I've sort of shifted that a bit because I had to move things around in my head so that if somebody was walking along the street, they would arrive at a certain place. And I made up road names and shops and whole lot.
So The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel is on Brigade Road? Which wouldn't be such an unusual thing.
Yes, exactly. No, it is. So what I say in the book, I've only just found this 1 minute ago, so you must excuse me. The hotel is advertised as a little corner of Britain, an oasis of oldie worldy charm in the midst of the hustle and bustle of modern Bangalore. And I've written, the Marigold was indeed an oasis. Around it, a new city had grown up. Property prices had rocketed. One by one, the neighbouring bungalows had been demolished and replaced with office blocks. Over the past 20 years, with the arrival of the high-tech revolution, business had boomed. The garden city was transformed into the corporate city, and the Marigold lost its customers to the big new hotels springing up along Brigade Road, the Oberoi, the Taj Balmoral, the Rameshri Comfort Inn, and they offer, obviously, you know, conference centres and stuff. And the Marigold Hotel is a subsiding old bungalow, you know, covered in bougainvillea and things, and rather romantic, but also not terribly operational. And the interesting thing is that when I went to watch the filming, I mean, I'm sure we'll get on to this, but I did stay in the real Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, which was extraordinary.
The real meaning the one in the film?
Yeah.
Did you? So tell me about that, the whole process. I mean, I know that Steven Spielberg has got you on speed dial or something. He just sort of rings you up, and your books, before you know it, your books have become great big Hollywood blockbusters. But how did it happen? And
if only. Well, the whole thing started because a long time ago, I mean, like way before 2004, I was thinking, what's going to happen to us all when we get older? Because nobody can afford to look after us because we live too damn long. You know, we're being hauled back from death by the miracles of modern medicine. And I thought, look, we outsource everything else. Why not outsource the elderly? And why not outsource them to India? Because we have language in common. The respect for old people in India is just wonderful, because, you know, often people keep them in their families. We are horrible to our old people in Britain. We shove them into care homes in the middle of a ploughed field and forget all about them. And I mean, I may be a bit romanticizing that, but I thought, you know, India's warm, very good for your arthritis. There's always something going on in the street. And so if you're a bit incapacitated, you can sit in a chai shop and watch the world go by all day, constantly changing, constantly interesting. School children call you auntie and are very nice to you. You know, in England, we got horrible hoodies who sort of, you know, gob at you and things.
Snatch your purse, yeah.
I know, not all of them, some. It's cheap, it's warm. We're united by this language and by this residual sort of Raj that still sort of exists slightly. Certainly our link is very strong, as I said. We're so globalized now that, you know, if you want your grandchildren to visit, they'd far rather fly to India and have a nice holiday in Goa thrown in for practically the price it takes to go on a train trip to an old people's home in England, you know, because air flights are sort of scandalously cheap. So I thought all this all added up to a no-brainer. I thought, actually, you know, why not retire to India?
Quite the entrepreneur you are. I mean, I actually couldn't help thinking when I first read the book before the movie happened. I remember thinking she might have made more money just getting this idea through whichever channels you need to go through to get to start a care home in India. But that was a terrific business idea, really.
Well, funnily enough, I think that novelists and entrepreneurs have something in common. We're not so good at making money, but we've got a lateral mind, and we jump sideways and get two unlikely ideas sort of igniting together. So that is a money-making idea, and you know, it has sort of started a trend, because you'll find that, you know, in Thailand and I've seen it in India, you know, there are care homes opening up, because it's a sight better way of getting old, as long as you're not missing your grandchildren too much, and maybe you've got an old husband or wife with you, because India's so welcoming and it's so lovely.
I know. It sort of took on a bit of a poignancy, didn't it, with what's happened recently with the pandemic and what was happening in care homes across the UK. But I think that was just such a brilliant notion, the fact that, you know, you could send old people. I know when the movie happened, it kind of changed slightly, didn't it? It became more a story of older romance and, you know, being able to continue to dream and aspire for something beyond
it changed. Yes. It became a sort of, you know, geriatric romance, and for better or for worse. I mean, I actually, you know, had slightly mixed feelings because somebody else wrote it in the end, but then when I saw the caliber of the actors, and it had a big heart, and it had some good jokes, and it had wonderful scenes of India. And so and also it gave huge pleasure to people. I think one of the reasons was that it talked about cultural East-West Indian British attitudes without laboring them, or without being too political or serious. And it talked about getting old without endlessly talking about incipient death. Because, you know, I'm 72, you know, I'm jolly old, and you don't think of yourself as old. You're the same person you always were. And with grey hair. Well, actually, I've dyed mine, but I've got a bit of grey because of this pandemic. And well, this pandemic, you see, we can't
wear my glasses to look at that grey. No, you can't see it.
I've got grey roots.
You're fine.
I've got COVID roots, but I think that it made people realise it was quite groundbreaking in its quite modest way, the film. So this is why I liked it. And of course, it's in the book as well. The book, as you say, is more complex and darker in a way. But it's saying that we live, hopefully, such a long time nowadays that after retirement age, if we've got the spirit and the imagination, we can have a whole new episode in our lives. and also that we aren't different. We're just the same. We're not old people. We are the same person. We're Jaishree, we're Deborah, we're whatever. We just, you know, when you get older, you'll realize this. And the film reflected that. And most films about old people are about dying, really. Dementia and death, you know.
You're right. They're much less cheerful films, and this one was everything that I think your novels are as well, which is humane and funny and touching and all of that all at once. So I can see that it was difficult. Certainly, it was difficult for me to dislike the movie, despite the fact that I could see I loved the book so much, and I could see that there were slight differences between the two. But I thought they did a marvelous job. What about the subsequent? Because there was a spin-off film, and then here in the UK we've had the spin-off TV series, which I think will make its way to India. I'm not sure it's already not available on one of the other platforms, you know, Netflix and so on.
Yeah.
But the real Marigold Hotel.
Yes. Well, the spin-off film, the second best Exotic Marigold Hotel, I had nothing to do with at all. Nothing.
Oh.
So, you know, they just did it. And that was
disappointing, because I have this sort of vision of you and Steven Spielberg just sort of, you know, linking hands and wandering off into an Indian sunset. I thought he does everything.
No, actually, and Steven Spielberg was involved in my film Tulip Fever, not in this one. This was Fox. This was 20th Century Fox, another studio. But it was the TV spin-off, the documentary, which might, as you say, come to India. I wasn't even asked about that, and I was miffed, I must say, because they just did it. And I did email them saying, how about, you know, a little, take me out to lunch or send me a bunch of flowers or something, you know, and they just sent an email saying you have no legal rights over this matter. So I was a bit miffed, I must say.
Oh, I think I do remember something I read in the papers. I think something that you said about Miriam Margolyes. It wouldn't have had Miriam Margolyes farting her way around Australia if it hadn't been for your book.
I know, India, absolutely. She's a great farter, doesn't she?
That's a real shame, though, because I think there's so much to be had. There's such a resource that was, you know, to be mined from just studying your books. But in the first one, you did actually go across to Jaipur, and you said you stayed in the hotel. Do you have any sort of juicy stories from that?
Well, the interesting thing was, it wasn't shot. It was some of the street scenes was shot in Jaipur, and one or two interiors were shot in a lovely hotel with lovely painted frescoes that the Jaipur Literary Festival is held in a lot. I've now forgotten the name.
Tiggy Palace, probably.
Yes, yeah, that's it.
Yes, I think I do remember that.
But the main best Exotic Marigold Hotel is right in the middle of the countryside. It's an equestrian hotel I mean, it's quite shabby. It's enchantingly shabby, still is. And I went to visit it and had the most extraordinary time, because I think they wanted somewhere far away so that they weren't disturbed by the noises and, you know, all that stuff. And they could just hole up with the cast and the crew. So it was a huge Indian crew, huge British crew, and of course many extras and things. So they found this place, and it's called the Kempur something Raja Kempur Hotel, I think it's called. And it's outside Udaipur, about an hour and a half's drive.
Okay.
And so I went with my husband, who I'd only married quite recently. That shows you can have another life, you know, in later life. And we drove for about an hour and a half from Udaipur, and there was just the most wonderful sight, because the countryside around there is not spectacular. It's quite sort of dusty and grey, a few trees, a few goats, you know, the odd camel. And suddenly in the distance, there was this shimmering white mirage, and I thought I was seeing things. And as we drove nearer, I saw that actually it was the unit wagons, the catering tents. It was this whole film shoot surrounded by these extras who were just sitting around, and there were Rajasthani, lovely, gorgeous men in turbans, you know, swatting mosquito bites with their camels, waiting for their shot. There were young bloods up from Mumbai, because the hotel had to reflect a big city, of course, because it was pretending to be in Jaipur. They built a bazaar around it. And so there were these gorgeous young, chic, lovely Indian boys, all in advertising and movie making and things, with their dark glasses and their motorbikes and their iPhones and everything. So there were extras of every sort of person to reflect a bazaar. And when we got nearer, we saw that they had indeed built this bazaar around the hotel, because the hotel was next to a tiny village, otherwise there was nothing. And they'd laid a road, they'd covered the road in dust, they'd put kites caught in the trees and old carrier bags blowing around, stalls selling things. And it was so lifelike that I went up to a stall to buy something and realized, of course, that he was an extra. You know, you couldn't buy anything, it was a film set. And there was
You're giving all their secrets away now.
But the best moment was we arrived and the cast, Dev Patel and Judi Dench and Maggie Smith and everything, they're all resting between takes in a row.
One hell of a cast that was, isn't it?
One hell of a cast. I think they all wanted to go to India. Who wouldn't in November, you know, and stay in a hotel together? They all adore each other. They've all acted and stuff. Anyway, and punkawallahs were holding, you know, brollies behind them and things, bottles of water. And Judi Dench, I think it was, she jumped up and she said something which actors always forget to say, but she's so wonderfully gracious. And she said, "How lovely to see you," and gave me a hug. And she said, "We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for your lovely book." Because actors and directors, they all forget. They forget because making a film is such a vast undertaking, so complicated, and everything can go wrong, and there are millions of people around. They forget that actually, you know, I had sat at home on my laptop, tapping away, making up their characters. And it was lovely that. It was really nice. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, I went back on a Best Exotic tour. I was a sort of tour guide from England, because quite a lot of those tours started up. And I went to stay in the hotel, and it's completely unchanged. It had a sign outside saying Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, but it was wonderfully dusty and everything. And the reception desk was like in the film. It was just a table covered in dust with an old Dell computer that was ever used, empty cubby holes behind it with a sort of one, you know, Toblerone in one of them or something, you know, no question of room service or anything. And
this wasn't a sketch, this was the real thing.
This is the real thing. And you know, the tap's coughing out a bit of brown water if you were lucky, and the hot tap doing cold and the cold tap doing hot. And I said to the manager who I was very fond of, got very fond of, and who liked me because I'd bought so much custom to the hotel, I said to him, "Why haven't you tarted it up?" And he said, "Because it's more romantic this way." And my theory is that he really adored his horses, because it's an equestrian hotel and the stables were spotless, beautiful. We could have all stayed in the stables. Beautiful, beautiful Rajasthani horses with, they have ears like the narrow heads and ears sorts of going in like a sickle.
I don't know horses as well as that. Okay, now I'll take your word.
Nor did I, but I'm quite horsey. So, and there was a beautiful stallion and everything. And so the horses were in these wonderful quarters, and the hotel was just this darling, dusty, romantic hotel, unchanged. And I was very pleased that it was, actually. But I mean, obviously people go and stay there, and the village, I think, is thriving because people go and they take tea and they have their hair cut and things there, you know.
I'm glad you benefited from the film, even though you didn't actually get involved in the scripting, which seems like such a waste to me on their part, really. But I do want to also talk about your script writing work, because that was the other work project of yours that I absolutely adored, was Pride and Prejudice. And again, I think that I mean, there have been so many dramatizations of this story since the 18th century. It's only a matter of time. I'm not sure which of the versions have been to India, but a lot of people in India would have read Pride and Prejudice, obviously, would be very familiar with the characters. So I'm hoping that this will be familiar as well to the audience that we will be getting today. But I'd love to know how you had the gumption, really, to take on the iconic Austen, and this thing that's been done. I mean, you've had Laurence Olivier, and we've had, heaven knows, Colin Firth, just so many great actors playing Mr. Darcy. So what was all of that like for you, getting involved in such a big project?
Well, it's a big challenge because people feel a very strong sense of ownership of the book because they love it, because it's the perfect rom-com. It's the original rom-com. And it gives hope to women all over the world that you don't have to be as beautiful as your older sister. As long as you've got intelligence and wit and an original mind, you can snaffle the most eligible man in Britain. So, I mean, I think that's partly, you know, and
that's the ongoing, the evergreenness of it, isn't it?
Yes, and it's so funny. But so I was quite nervous because I'd also adapted The Diary of Anne Frank for the BBC, and both The Diary of Anne Frank and Pride and Prejudice are the two most beloved books in Britain, certainly, and worldwide, anyway. So I felt slightly intimidated, but I thought, well, look, it hasn't been done as a film, it's been done as television. Since you're the one you were saying, Laurence Olivier and all that lot, Greer Garson, and that
there was an Indian version called Bride and Prejudice, which I think was WorldLit does. And again, it lends itself very well to the Indian setting as well. You know, the parents to get their 4 daughters married off, married well, and so on.
Exactly. There's many parallels, and I think that film hooked into those brilliantly. So what I thought was that with a classic like that, each new generation needs a new version of it, because the world changes so much and young women aren't like they were 20 years ago even. So I thought that I'll make the humour spring out of real desperation that Lizzie Bennet, I'm presuming people know the story, I can't explain the story. It sounds a bit banal when I explain it anyway, which it isn't, obviously. But that if Elizabeth Bennet, what we don't understand nowadays is, certainly in Britain with a welfare state that can scoop you up, that if one of those girls didn't marry well, that family would be out, they'd lose their house. And there was no safety net. There was a dark, cold, muddy world outside where people would starve. And so it really mattered that somebody had to get married well. And so Mrs. Bennet, pushing Elizabeth Bennet into the arms of that terrible, ghastly, oleaginous curate in the book, Mr. Collins, she was actually doing a rather valiant job. She was trying to get the family saved, even though it might mean sacrificing a daughter. So I wanted the comedy to come out of that, and I wanted it to concentrate entirely on Elizabeth Bennet. And because it's a movie and you have a big screen, you can read a lot of the inner life of Elizabeth Bennet on her face.
She was very good, I thought. Keira Knightley, I thought, did a brilliant job.
She was brilliant. Some people didn't like her. She brought mixed feelings, but I thought she was wonderful and very honest and open. And I think that because a novel, and you know, because we're in Bangalore talking about books as well as the screen, what a novel can tell you, as we all know, and why we love them, is that they can tell us the inner life of the character. You know, and we can go into their childhood and their hopes and their dreams and, you know, all sorts of stuff. In a film, all we can do is to see what happens. And that inner life is written on the actors' faces. That's how they earn their money, if they're good film actors. And so their reactions to the world is the equivalent of the inner world of the novel. And so I wanted us to have a really honest and open Elizabeth Bennet, whose face would register that. And I think Keira Knightley did it really well.
I think everything about that movie, actually, it's certainly, and I'm not saying this hand on heart because I've got you sitting here in front of me, but it worked. It had a sort of modern sensibility to it. It had something very real about it. Was the previous one the one with the Jennifer Earle? Isn't that it?
Really?
Colin
Yes,
Firth, anyway. Everyone remembers Colin Firth and his red shirt, really. So that version. was much more sort of arch and had this was all about push-up bras and it was more about costume and all of that. Whereas this, you actually had the girls returning from a walk with sort of muddied hems of their dresses, and the house they lived in was just so much more real, a house. And, there was, I don't know how much of that would have been, down to your scripting, or whether those are things those are touches brought in by the director, but it was just felt like a metrosexual, real sort of depiction of Darcy, and all the characters I thought were so much more relatable.
Well, that's interesting, Jaishree, you say that, because I called it the muddy hem version. Because
I honestly didn't know that.
I know, because I wanted it to be real. I wanted the girls to be really young and no makeup, red noses, same dresses every day, because that family was on its uppers. And although they live in quite a grand house, as you pointed out, the house itself is a pit. It's really messy. And the camera, Joe Wright, who directed it, he'd never read Jane Austen and he'd never read Pride and Prejudice, so he came to it completely fresh. And I think that freshness helped as well. And
there's something to be said.
Yeah, and the girls, the Bennet daughters, lived in that house. They didn't spend the night there, but they each had a bedroom and they got very intimate with the house, so it was their home. And they knew how to sort of lounge around in it. And they didn't just sit drinking tea with a little finger, because in Jane Austen, often they're sewing away, or they're drinking tea. And it's also sort of starchy, and it's not starchy life, They sat around and lounged around and had stomach aches and opened their dresses a bit because they're a bit tight and all sorts of things. And it had that sort of messiness. And I think that because of that, when in the film we moved into sort of high Regency world of Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, we could see that this Bennet family were a bit sort of hugger-mugger and a bit, a bit rough and ready. Because it wasn't a sort of Regency house with Regency furniture. Because why do people, if they live in, only Regency times, have Regency furniture? We don't have 2021 furniture. We've got all sorts of old stuff we've got from all over the place. So I think that Joe Wright, the director, ran with that. It was a note in the script, but he really ran with it. And in the opening sequence, if people have seen it, you've got Elizabeth Bennet walking home to her house, and she walks through all the washing that's hanging up, and you can see what a labour it's been to do all that washing by hand, very heavy sheets and all that stuff. It was a lovely film to watch, I must say.
I know, and if anyone has the choice of which Pride and Prejudice film to watch, this is the one. Just look out for Joe Wright, director, Deborah Moggach, script writer.
Absolutely, but before I forget, there was one other story about Best Exotic, which I must tell you, which is that the premiere was held in the Curzon Cinema in London in Mayfair, and they had dressed the street. They closed off the street and dressed it with marigold garlands and things, so it looked absolutely wonderful. It was midwinter when this one. Celia Imrie, who plays what's her face in it, she was in a play at the Old Vic, and she's a real sport, Celia Imrie. Madge she plays, and so when the curtain came down right across London, the Old Vic's like 4 miles away or something from there. Anyway, when the curtain came down, she jumped on the back of a motorbike. She changed into a sari, jumped on the back of a motorbike, was biked up to the premiere where she arrived and things. So we were all going up the red carpet. And as I was going up the red carpet, there were all these photographers, and I could hear them calling out, Deb. And I thought, they're calling out for me. And so I turned and smiled at them, and I realized they were saying Dev, because it was Dev Patel behind me. They were all calling out Dev. And I felt so embarrassed that I thought it was for me.
Well, they didn't know that you thought it was you they were calling. So.
Then I thought none of them would be there if it wasn't for me, but I'm only the writer. And with films, as I was saying, the writer's the last person anyone thinks about.
You sort of have to get used to slipping into the shadows and letting everyone else take credit, isn't it? I mean, that I was partially in preparation for our meeting today. I was reading some of the reviews to remind myself of the film. And I did think, you know, it sort of seems like such a shame that the writer kind of gets shunted out. You sort of expected to retire gracefully once you've written your book. Never mind the various spin-offs that certainly a book like These Foolish Things or Exotic Marigold Hotel, as it's called now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do want to talk also about my absolute favorite book of yours, Deborah, and that is, I'm sure you don't need to I don't need to tell you, it's Tulip Fever.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I thought I might have told you this once before, because I have a little Deborah Moggach anecdote, and if you'll give me a minute to just...
Yeah, go on.
I don't know whether I've told you, I have a feeling I have mentioned this to you before, but I tell everybody else that I meet about it. But your book was, Tulip Fever, was one that sort of inspired me to try my hand at historical fiction. I'd never tried writing historical fiction before, and I did. I think it was sometime 2004 or thereabouts, I wrote, and some of the audience here will know, a book called Rani, which is about a real-life Indian queen who fought the British in the 1857 uprising and lost her life on the battlefield. And because it's a story that everyone in India knows, I knew I had to do something with the ending. Because I thought it's a boring ending. Everyone knows she dies in battle. And so how does one make it a little less obvious? And that, I think what I did was I reread Tulip Fever around that time to kind of remind myself of how you go around doing this, what was for me quite a difficult genre to deal with. And the ending, it was like a little epiphany for me. I suddenly thought, I know what I'm going to do, because there was always sort of ballads that suggested that the queen never actually died, that she lived in secrecy, that her supporters kind of whisked her away from the forest and, you know, gave her, and she basically lived the life of a poor woman after that, but she was still alive. And so when I read Tulip Fever, I don't want to give your ending away in case anyone here is thinking I've got to read this book, because it is a truly wonderful book set in 17th century Amsterdam about real tulip mania. So what I did was I had a veiled woman in the end wandering through a bazaar, and I leave it to the reader to decide who that might have been. And then I sent it off, and within days it got commissioned. And I panicked slightly when it was commissioned, because I thought, I can't have that ending go. It's so much like Deborah Moggach's ending in Tulip Fever. So I was sort of thinking of telling the editors to just remove the last chapter. It was like an epilogue, to remove it, when the editor in a phone conversation with me said, and you know what, we absolutely loved the ending. It's just such a powerful way to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the queen didn't die. And I thought, I couldn't possibly tell them this. And I emailed you, which is why I thought I might have told you the story. You probably get loads of people emailing you, Debbie. So this is nothing new for you. But I emailed you and said, I'm so sorry, but I loved your book so much, and I think I might have inadvertently pinched your ending. And you wrote back to me, it was quite a short mail, and you wrote back saying, pinch my ending? Ah, I pinched my ending from the French lieutenant's woman.
Yes.
Did you?
It's true.
So I double pinched in that case.
That's so true. How interesting. God.
I did want this audience to hear your story about Tulip Fever, though, and your little wager with Tracy Chevalier, who was recently on this very same portal, actually.
Yes.
That's
right.
About that.
It was a very extraordinary sort of confluence between her and me, because I got the idea for it by buying a 17th century Dutch painting. And if people go on my website and look up Tulip Fever, there's a reproduction of the painting of a woman. It's a sort of sub-Vermeer painting of a woman getting ready to go out. And she's got her maid servant's bringing her a little pearl necklace, and a man is giving her a glass of wine. And she's looking out of the canvas at us in a rather mysterious way, which I thought looked as if she was up to no good. I bought it. I bought it from an auction and hung it in my sitting room, and just got more and more fascinated by her, because I thought she's gone somewhere she shouldn't. She's going somewhere she shouldn't be going. And at the same time, I read about this Tulip Mania which was this extraordinary phenomenon. For 2 years, between 1636 and 1638, I think, the whole of the Netherlands, the whole of the Dutch Republic was caught up in this mad craze for gambling on tulip bulbs, and huge fortunes were made and lost. And it became like the South Sea bubble. It was quite extraordinary. And they were gambling on what colour the blooms would be when they came out, the flowers. And if they were what's called broken, which is stripy, they'd be worth, I mean, one of them was worth the price of a house, that bulb. I mean,
and this actually happened.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of money floating around in Holland.
Very rich. Amsterdam was very rich then, because they had this huge empire and were very successful as a country. So I thought, what a wonderful image for a symbol for human love of beauty, but also sort of greed and stupidity as well. And so I made up this love story, because it's really a love story between a young woman who's married to a pedantic old merchant. She's really she's married him to keep her family safe, really, and she's a sacrificial lamb, really. Yeah. She's a bit trapped, and a young painter who comes to paint their portrait, and it's a big love affair, and the couple cook up a plan to elope together, and they gamble on tulip bulbs to get the money to go to abroad, Java or somewhere, and it goes disastrously wrong, of course, because it's a novel, so it's bound to go disastrously wrong. And when I finished it, it was extraordinary, because when I finished it, and it was published, before it was even published, as you were saying, mentioning Steven Spielberg, it was optioned by a producer, and the producer got a call within a week of me giving in manuscript in, saying, "This is Steven Spielberg, I'm calling from my car. You know, I've never been so excited by a book," and things. She thought somebody was joking, but it was him. Goodness. And within a week, she and I had flown to Hollywood to have a meeting with him, and it was going to be the big British film of the year. It was going to be a $48 million movie and all sorts of things. But anyway, that's another story, because it all went disastrously wrong. But very soon after the book came out, I was sent a proof copy of Girl with a Pearl Earring. And Tracy Chevalier, who, as we were saying, was on only recently on your video, and she got in touch with me. She lives nearby in London. And she said, you know, "Oh God, everyone's going to think I've copied you. Everyone's going to think I've done a Jaishree, done a copy." And I said, "Look, don't worry." I was rather patronizing. I said, "Don't worry, Tracy. You know, when your book comes out, I'll give it a lovely review, and we'll do literary events together. And, you know, I'll talk about your book and you can talk about mine. And, you know, I sort of be on my coattails." And so what happened was I gave it a good review, because it hadn't had many reviews. Also, it had a terrible cover, because considering it's about one of the most beautiful, famous paintings in the world, that if you see it in a bookshop, that girl with the pearl earring, that face, you immediately look at it. I mean, it couldn't be more eye-catching. Yeah. They put by some perverse thing, they put a jacket on of a Vermeer, the only Vermeer sort of scene of street life of Harlem, I think, or wherever, you know, with lots of church towers and things, in sort of black and white as well. I mean, anyway, so they rejacketed the book. It became a huge hit, a bigger hit than mine, really. Although mine was pretty big hit. They both were, really, but they both caught some zeitgeist. And of course, hers was immediately made into a very successful film with our friend Colin Firth in it. And mine became, you know, mine took 20 years to develop, and everything went wrong. And then it was just about.
Why did it take so long?
Because people kept on being hauled in to write it. It was rewritten and rewritten, and it kept new writers kept losing the plot, because it's got a very, I say it myself, it's got a fantastic plot.
Yeah,
with big twists.
Does, and they should have just called you in. You see, this is what I mean about wasted resources.
I know. I did it, then somebody else did it. Christopher Hampton did it. Tom Stoppard did it. Lots of writers, and so it became a bit of a sort of pudding, really, a sort of mess. But it finally was about to be made, And John Madden, who directed The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, very good director. Keira Knightley was a young woman. Jude Law was the young painter, and Jim Broadbent was the boring old husband. And
I have been searching high and low for this, and I can't seem to get it. It will reappear on Netflix.
This is different. This is a different film because it was eventually made. But anyway, what happened with that film, to cut a long story short, was it was just about to be, it was a $48 million film, the big British film of the year. All the sets had been done, the costumes, tanks dug to make canals and things. The Gordon Brown, our Chancellor then, there was some tax arrangement for tax-friendly arrangements for funding films, and he destroyed it overnight because people were fiddling the books, and the film was destroyed. And everything. The Tracy Chevalier comes back into this story because overnight the film collapsed. Everyone lost their jobs. It was awful, and there was a nursery in Thames Ditton outside London that were growing 12,000 tulips for the film, and each tulip was in its own little pot, and it was about this high in bud so that it could flower for its moment in the film in 2 weeks or whatever. And the nursery said, well, you know, what are you going to do with these? You know, the film's not happening. And I said, well, why don't you deliver 500 to my front garden? And Tracy lived up the road. She took some. Other people took various tulip bulbs, neighbours. And every year I'd see my little film come up in their front gardens, which was very And Tracy and I had this bet that whoever film was made first would buy the other one lunch at the Ivy. So Tracy took me off to the Ivy because her film was made. And the whole thing collapsed. But then, and Steven Spielberg disappeared. But then our saviour rode out of the sunset. But unfortunately, our saviour was called Harvey Weinstein.
Oh, of course.
So out of the frying pan into the fire. He then developed it. And in fact, a film was made with Judi Dench and Alicia Vikander and Cara Delevingne and Tom Hooper, lots of people. Really beautiful film, actually.
But is that why it can't be found now for Love No Money? Because of the Weinstein connection?
Yeah, because what happened when the whole sex scandal blew up, some films that he was producing, like Paddington 2, just took his name off them and put them in the cinemas. But this film had had a lot of difficulties with editing. He'd bossed around the editors and had put his own people in and had got me to rewrite stuff and all sorts of things. And so people were feeling quite chary about the film anyway, the cinemas, because they thought it must be a turkey, as it was constantly being pulled. He'd announce it and then pull it. Anyway, finally, it came out for only 1 week, with no press and nothing, because that's the way he thought it should be released, just to get it onto DVD. And that week, practically, the whole sex scandal blew up and the Weinstein Company was dissolved overnight. So I hired a cinema and had my own premiere. And because I'm an extra in the film, I'm always an extra in my film. I'm an old crone drinking a tankard in an Amsterdam sitting room. And so I hired a cinema in London and got some wine in and got 120 friends and put on the movie, and that was our premiere. So instead of all the stars lined up, you know, me and one other extra, a man called Terry Nunn, took to the stage to introduce the film, and I played this old crone, and he played a brewer in trundling a barrel along the street or something, and they cut his part anyway. So I mean, he was. So we introduced the film, and we said, let's raise our glasses to all the small people without whom films can't be made.
Well said.
The costume and the extras and all that stuff. And so it was a rather charming alternative premiere.
And you're still talking to Tracy.
Yes. No, there's no hard feelings, and I'm very glad her film was a success. And you can get this
something about a book that becomes a successful film sort of loses its own identity, isn't it? And I don't know if that can possibly be a silver lining to such a messy story. But the fact is, Tracy Chevalier's the film made on her book is always talked about just that little bit more than the book itself is, I think.
Well,
whereas
funnily enough, in her case, I don't think that's happened because the film was an art house film, quite a small film. And the book has been a bestseller for ages and still you see it in bookshops. So I think she's unusual, but it does happen and the book can fade away. But what you have to remember is that the film lies like a hologram over the book and the film will fade away because you can't have films on all the time and the book will always remain. So that's what one comforts oneself with.
Good. I know, nice and optimistic.
There are worse things in the world.
in the few minutes we have left, I think about 10 minutes, I do want to talk about the most recent book, your The Carer, which I read recently and again, absolutely loved. I don't think there's a single book of yours I haven't loved anyway. So, I'm starting to sound repetitive. But I did want to ask you about, I mean, we've already touched a little bit upon being old and different perceptions of being old. And I think you just do it so well. I think the character, one of the main characters in it, James, is, I mean, the portrayal of him is, it's a complex story, and you on the one level you hate him, and on the other hand you love him, you identify with him. And how do you do this time and again? You've got these characters who, by and large, writers are sort of if not told by their agents, but you're kind of steered away from writing about old people too much. And the other thing in it is the sort of class divide. Again, you've done that so beautifully. So I wonder whether, because I think it's still a relatively new and unknown entity, isn't it? So I don't know whether you want to just say a little bit about the book, and what you brought, what it meant for you.
Yes, it was. I wanted to write about a different look at old age, because I'd done obviously The Best Exotic, which was one solution, and this solution was, to have a carer and a live-in carer. And it was only quite recently, I mean, the book came out 2 years ago, the paperback came out this year, and it came out in the middle of the pandemic in Britain. And people suddenly were talking about these invisible people who look after old people and keep them alive and keep them fed, and and they're completely unknown, and they're underpaid and underappreciated. We now all have been clapping for carers
every Thursday.
Every Thursday.
I know the Mandy character very well, because I have a daughter with special needs, and I meet Mandys all the time. People who've and there is, I could see all of the things, a little bit of scorn that Phoebe and Robert have for the person who's caring for their parent.
Yeah.
It comes from this kind of class prejudice. And I know that I remember my husband telling me once, our daughter Rohini is turning into a chav. And that, without thinking about it, we had a little laugh about the fact that she colors her hair a certain way now, and she wears certain sorts of jewelry, and she wears clothes in a certain way, and she's becoming a bit like her carers, was our fear. But I saw this in the book and I thought, this is amazing. How does Debbie know all these things?
That's very interesting, because it's obviously a different age group, but the influence of the carer on the person was something which I've heard. And I had with my own mother, because she had some live-in carers when she got dementia, and they started sort of dressing her differently. And in the book, what happens is the old boy James, this carer Mandy, middle-aged carer, comes along, and she starts changing him into somebody slightly different. And his grown-up children both sort of resent her, are terribly guilty that they're not doing it themselves. Rely on her hugely, sort of like her, but the class thing, as you were saying, creeps in, because their very distinguished old father, who's in his 80s and who was a professor of physics and had an OBE and stuff, he starts doing scratch cards on the lottery and watching daytime television and going to the Bicester retail village, which in England, which is not the sort of place that somewhere like that would go to, and she takes him down market, and he loves it. He has a hoot.
He's having the time of his life. Yeah.
He's had the time of his life. And the two children slightly resent this, but also they can't do anything, because they're not going to give up their lives to look after him. One of them's trying to write an absolutely impossibly difficult novel. Sounds, a quite a boring novel set in old Radnorshire dialect, Welsh dialect. The other one's having a terrible on-off affair with a man who lives in a hut in Wales. Both their lives are pretty chaotic, and they haven't got time or inclination or skills to look after their father. And they also, and this is what happens in the book, they start to get a bit suspicious of her because they find that she's been sort of fiddling around with their father's papers and maybe looking at his will, and, you know, is she going to kill him off and get him to write the will in favour of her or something? So there's, and then halfway through the book, there's a humongous plot twist which throws everything in a completely different direction.
But again, the unease that the son and daughter have towards how close their father's growing to the carer is another thing which I think the Indian in me was sort of recognizing straight away, because again, many of us who live in India and who have elderly parents in India sort of resort to having, you know, domestic help staff engaging with, you know, looking after our parents. And it's not such an unusual thing to begin to worry about how much control they're beginning to exert over the aging, you know, the elderly.
Well, that's the thing. And whatever age group you are, funnily enough, I had lunch yesterday with a man of my age who was brought up in India, and he, like many British people, he was looked after by an ayah he was much closer to than his mother, who was rather standoffish and stiff and British, and always at cocktail parties and things. And then he was sent to, you know, school in England. And the same thing happens with the elderly. You know, if you're having domestic help, you've got a helpless child or a helpless old person, and that domestic help is going to have central emotional importance in their life. And you better get used to it, you know, because that's going to happen.
The dramatic plot twist. I kept thinking there's a Hindi movie in this. It's made for Bollywood. So if there is someone listening in, just read a book called The Carer. It's got a brilliantly sort of something which I think a lot of Indians would identify with straight away. So thank you very much for the hours and hours of entertainment. Honestly, Debbie.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to talk to you again.
Well, I was remembering the last time we met was when I sort of collared you and got you to talk to my colleagues at the BBFC. I don't know whether you remember this. You talked about script writing. And then my boss, who, I mean, for people like me who've never had an expense account, you know, it was quite a delight that my boss said, oh, do take her out for a meal afterwards. And we went and had a great big meal at a Kerala restaurant. I remember that. And then when you mounted your cycle and sort of disappeared into the dusk, I thought that was the last I'd seen of you, actually. So maybe I can, wave you as you get onto your metaphoric bike and, you know, into the Bangalore dusk. You shall pedal away.
Lovely, that would be.
But it is so lovely, albeit virtually. It's been lovely to have you here in my living room.
It's very nice. I know, I'm looking at it. Yes, I have nice guests there.
But it sounds like you're back in London anyway now. So no reason why you shouldn't just come over.
Exactly.
There's no more lockdown. Yeah. Not for us anyway.
Well, thank you.
He's back. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.
Lovely. No, just such a delightful conversation. And I think most of us in Bangalore will be thrilled about the fact that we've started with Bangalore, ended with Bangalore, and had just so much of the city from two people that seem to love the city and know it perhaps in ways that a lot of us today don't. Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you,
Jay. It's older than you are, Shri. That's all.
That was such fun. Thank you all so much. That was great. Thank you, Jaishree. I'll see you in London.
See you soon.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you, Jaishree.
Bye.
Thank you all. We'll be back again soon.
Thank you. Bye.